In this video, we are going to talk about loops. Now, there are two different types of loops. There's the for loop, and then there's the while loop. First thing we're going to talk about is the for loop. Now, I've created, in this script, I've created two variables, A, and it's just a list of letters, A, B, C, and D. And then I have the second variable, B, which is just a list of numbers in the beginning. And I'm going to type a loop, and I'm going to type it all out, and then I'm going to explain it. So I'm going to say for I in A, colon, press an enter, and I'm going to type in print I. Okay, so what did I just type? I just typed in a for loop, and so let me in words explain what's going to happen here. So it's this first line is saying for every item in A, I want you to do this. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, there are 4 items in A, so that means this is going to loop 4 times. So what's happening is in the first occurrence, I equals the first item in A. And then it's going to print that item. Now in the next loop, I has a different value. This time in the second loop, I is the second value or the second item in A. So in that case, it'll be B. And then for the third, it'll be the third item and then the fourth item. Okay, so I'm going to save this, Control S, and then I'm going to run it, F5. And what happens is it prints A, because that's the first item, then prints B, that's the second item, then prints C, and then prints D. Now, obviously, there are more things we can do than just print items out. So let's do another for loop. For I in A. Now this is another for loop, so it's going to do another thing, and it's separated from this command here. So this is another for loop that I'm typing. Print I plus C. Now there's a couple things that happen. Whenever I press enter, it automatically inserted a tab. Now this tab here is very important. That tab specifies to Python that everything that has been tabbed needs to occur. Those lines of commands will occur for each loop. So if I were to, do B, or let's do C equals I plus C, then I type in C here, what's going to happen is for every item in A, in the first occurrence, I is going to equal the letter A. So now I is equal to A, then you're going to plus C. So if you remember about strings, it'll be AC. Now C is going to be printed. Now the next for the next occurrence, the next loop, I is going to be equal to B. So in that case, C is equal to BC, and then it's going to print C. So let's Control S, and let's press 5. So now you can see what happened. So this right here is the first loop that we've created, and that's just A, B, C, D. It's just printing the different items. The next one, it's adding C at the end of each letter. And again, for this for loop, each line that is tabbed is going to be assumed to be within the loop. If I were to press enter and then backspace and then say print I, let's do that. Well, let's see what happens. If I press F5, so I've got A, B, C, D, that's the first loop that's happening. And then I've got A, C, B, C, 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 and D, C, that's the second loop. But then I print I again, and it's D. Well, D is the last item in A. Well, where did this I come from? Well, the I came from this for loop. because in the first loop I equaled A, second loop I equals B, third loop I equals C, fourth loop I equals D, and then that was the for loop is only going to go to all the different items, and then it's going to leave the loop. It's done. It's going to continue the line of code. Well, at this point in the code, I now equals D, and it will equal D all the way through the rest of the code unless you change it. Okay, so that's one way you can know or understand, well, where did this for loop end off at? Like, what was the last value that it had? So for instance, if I print C again, Control save, F5, C is equal to DC, which was the last value it had in the last loop. So as you create these variables, you're creating, they continue to exist, of course, throughout the rest of the script. And one last thing, this code can be very long. I mean, you can have 30 lines of code within this for loop. You can have 100 lines of code within each for loop. So it's just a nice way of coding things, because if you didn't do the for loop, you would have to do, so for just the first loop, I would have to do print A0, print A1, print A2. And the thing is I'd have to keep on doing these lines, and I'd have to do it as long as for the entire length of the list. Well, that list could have 50 items in it, and I don't want to type in those many items. I want to do just the for loop. Not only that, but I may not know exactly how many items are in that list, and I wouldn't, or it may change depending on which instance of the code you're at. So you certainly, for loops are the way to go for sure. So I'm going to delete these. Well, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment them out. So I'm just going to comment out region. So that way it doesn't print out each time. All right, so now I'm going to talk about, we're going to continue to work on the for loop. I'm going to talk about a type of variable that's used very often in for loops, and that's called the range variable. Okay, so let me actually go over here to the command line to talk about a range variable. So I'm going to type in range, and let's just do 6. So what it does is it creates a variable that is of the full range from 0 to 6, and it automatically sets the first value at 0. So just to see what this range value is, I'm going to type in list. So it's going to convert this range variable into a list. So I'm going to do list range 6. Press enter, and you'll see it 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the range doesn't actually encode all that information. It's kind of it uses a more compressed format than actually storing each one of those values. So it's the range value, the range item is a little bit more quick and easier. And now notice that if I did just len range 6, it will give you the length of that range, which is 6. I mean, that's the same, that's what I typed in. It's literally the range will create a range of values starting at 0 and is 6 items long. Okay, so range is a very useful variable when it comes to for loops. So I'm gonna instantiate a variable. That's a word that's used a lot in coding, where you create a variable, and really just an empty variable that has all of the locations. It has placeholders for everything that you want to fill with the stuff you want. Okay, it's very important to actually instantiate a variable instead of just adding on using the append function of a list. So I'm going to instantiate a list I'm going to times length of 6, or length of A. Okay, so this is the length function. It just calculates how many items are in A, or how long A is, so how many items it has. And I use this double brackets, and the reason why is, let me just show you. If I were to do a single bracket times 6, it just creates a single item, or really just an empty list. I don't want to create an empty list. What I want to do is I want to create a list of 6 empty placeholders. Okay, so that's a way of instantiating a 6 position so that I can fill it with another value. Okay, so I've done that, and now I want to create my for loop. I'm going to use the range function. Okay, so for every item in the range of something that has the length of A. So this range value starts at 0 and has as many items as A does. Okay. And the reason why I want to do this is I want to actually create something. I don't want to just print things off. I want to actually create a list of items where I've done some sort of calculation. So I'm going to do BI. So now this range, this I is now giving me an index value. It's going to start at 0, so position 0, then position 1, position 2, position 3. And now we know that B has the length of A, because I did this, double brackets times the length of A, so I know how long it's going to be. So B, for the first index, I want you to have it equal to the string I plus AI. Okay, so what's going on? What it's doing is it's turning I into a string and then adding it to that particular item in A at that index, which in the first for loop, the index is going to be 0, so this is going to be the letter A, and this is going to be the character 1, or string of number 1. So let's save this. Let's see what happens. Oh, so let me print B. And let me actually put an enter. It's important to space things out so that you can see them. So I'm going to save it. And so now you see I have 0A, 1B, 2C, 3D. Okay, because it's converting that index into a string, and it's adding it to that place, that item in A. So it's converting that index into, so it'd be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's adding it to A each time. Okay, so that's for loops. A lot of things, infinite number of things you can do with for loops. I just barely scratched the surface. So let's comment that out. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about while loops. So for loops will go through the entire length of an item, okay? But a while loop will go infinitely long. It'll go on forever until you build a stopping feature. So if you don't stop the while loop, it will continue forever. You can always use like Control-C in the command prompt to get it to stop. Sometimes we create while loops and we're sitting there for a long time, we're wondering what's going on. Well, it's looping through this while loop, and I forgot to create something to make sure that it stops. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So I'm going to create a new variable, I equals 0. Okay, so that I is kind of like our, it's not really an iterator, but it's this item that we're using to cycle through something. So I equals 0 while I is less than the length of A. Still use a colon. This colon is a very important part. If I didn't mention it before, you must include that colon in every for loop, in every while loop, and actually for if and else statements. Okay, so while I is less than the length of A, I want you to print I. And then I want you to, at the end of this, I want you to, and I'm just speaking as if I'm communicating to Python, I want it to I plus 1. Okay, so this is a special kind of coding notation. What this means is each time I want you to add 1. So let me just show you what's going on here. So I'm going to do A equals 0. A plus equals 1. So now A equals 1. If I do A plus equal 1, now A equals 2. And so each time you do this line of code, it's going to add 1. Now you can do anything. You can plus equal 2. That's going to add 2 to the value. So now A equals 4. So before it was 2. I added 2, and then now A equals 4. So now what this is going to do is, while I is less than length of A, it's going to do this. So it's going to print I, and then it's going to add I to that value. So in the beginning it was 0. Now it's going to equal 1, and it's going to go back to this while loop. It's going to check, is I less than the length of A? And it's only 1, and the length of A is 4, so that's a true statement. So it's gonna print I, then it's gonna add 1. Next time it's gonna be 2. It's gonna ask, is the length less, is 2 less than the length of A? Well, 2 is 4, so that's true. So it's gonna do this every time, while this continues to be true, it's going to do this function. Well, at some point, when you add 1, I is going to equal to 5, and 5 is not less than the length of A, so it's going to stop. It's not going to run this line of code. All right, so let's watch that happen. Control S. Okay. So it does 0, 1, 2, and 3. So it's printing I. So it stops at 3, okay, because whenever I equals 4, it equals the length of A. So when it equals the length of A, this statement is no longer true, and so it's going to actually exit this code, and it's going to work on the next line of code, but not the code within the while loop. Okay, now you don't have to just add 1, so I'm going to comment this out. Okay. And let's do another while loop. This time I'm going to have I equals 1. And this time we're going to do while I is less than 200. I want you to print I. And I want to do I times equals 2. So now this time, each time it's going to multiply that value by 2. And you can do you raise to the power of 2, any of these operators will work. So let's see what happens now. Control S, and 5. So now it's 1, 2, 4, it's doubling each time. So using this line of code where you do the operator equals 2 or equals 1 or whatever number you want, it's going to each add it. That's a very common practice when doing a while loop. In fact, almost every time it's done that way. So what we've covered is we've done for loops, we've talked about the range function, we've talked about the length of variables, len, that's another function, and then we talked about while loops. Both for loops and while loops are used very frequently. I would say that for loops is used more often, but while loops are really cool and fun to use, and they are very handy.